So let's start the talk for today. So hi everyone. Today we have Joshua who will talk about avoiding catastrophic risks from uncontrolled AI agency. So just a few house rules like if you have any question during the talk, raise your hand and wait for me to pass you the mic so that people online can also hear your questions. And people watching the talk remotely, just type your question in the chat and I will basically convey your question at the right moment. And also we will have like 15-minute slot at the end of the talk for questions. So yeah, that's it. Let's start the talk.
Thank you. Thanks for allowing me to share things today about what I've been working on over the last year mostly. And also the reason why I created a nonprofit called Law Zero that was announced last week, for those who didn't know. So I'm going to start by a bit of a sort of personal angle of how I got into this trajectory. It's somewhat different from what I've been doing for the previous 40 years. And yeah, it's really around January 2023 that it kind of became clear to me that I at least had been underestimating the speed at which we could approach human level AI and the acceleration of what our work in academia translated into these big systems could become. I realized that a lot of things that were there and are now even more clearly there would have sounded like science fiction just a year before ChatGPT came out, and that we should maybe open our mind to the possibility that this kind of trend continues. Since then, I'll talk about the international report on AI safety that I've been sharing, and a lot of groups have been accumulating data to help us see that trajectory and anticipate it. But at that time, it became clear that a lot of my enthusiasm for advances in AI turned into, but what if all this power, all this intelligence is applied to nefarious goals, one way or the other, by humans, or if we lose control. And although I had heard a lot of these discussions before for almost a decade, I didn't take it very seriously because I thought, oh, human level AI is like, oh, decades in the future, and we'll get so many good things before we get there. And so I didn't really pay attention to those risks. But I started thinking, or rather, I started feeling, what about my children? What about my grandchild, who's just 1 year old? Are they going to have a life in 20 years? And by that time in January 23, I was thinking, well, there's a very high probability that in the next 20 years, we do get to human level AI. And do we know how to make sure that all this intelligence is going to be used in a way that's beneficial to humanity? Or could it become, a cause of catastrophic outcomes? And I realized I didn't have the answer and that nobody had the answers. It was kind of difficult to make that pivot from a lot of enthusiasm into having to face the possibility, even small, that catastrophic things could follow. And I think in this, like many of my colleagues, I felt the challenge of having to accept possibilities that go against all the things I had been saying, a lot of the things that I had been saying. So yeah, it's how this journey started. About 6 months later, I was approached by the UK government to lead this international AI safety report, which was published last January this year, and is meant to be a synthesis of the science in AI safety that could inform policymakers. It was designed in part inspired by the IPCC format of the UN, but without any policy recommendations. Just, what are the facts? What can we reasonably expect in terms of future trajectories? What do we know about the risks? What do we know about mitigation, and so on? So that these were the three questions, like, where are we? Where might we go? What are the risks? A broad spectrum of risk has been studied in that report. And what do we know in terms of how to reduce those risks? So one of the things that became very striking working on this report is the large number of papers that were trying to keep track of advances in various ways. I mean, we do that all the time in machine learning, but it's just looking at these curves in aggregate over many different kinds of benchmarks sends a very clear message that we're building more and more capable AIs. We haven't reached human level, and there are many problems, but it keeps going up. And there is this shift that has happened with the release of the first reasoning models like O1 and then O3 and DeepSeek and so on. This inference scaling that is opening a new door. Where that will lead is very difficult, but I think it would be foolish to assume that we're done and that there won't be any more advances in coming years or that we'll hit a wall. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. I think we need to plan for these two possibilities. The other thing that came a bit late in writing the report is the advances on agency, and I'll show a curve about that. But I want to mention there's a reason why companies are investing massively in building more agency, more autonomy into AI systems. And it's because it's going to allow them to make tons and tons of money, because the low-hanging fruit economically is just replacing the tasks that people do by, machines doing it. We can have a discussion over like, is that a good thing from society's point of view? Maybe some of it, maybe not. But clearly, this curve shows that agentic capabilities, as measured by the length of tasks that an AI can solve, where the length is measured by how much time a human needs, that has been growing exponentially. So this is from a Meter paper that came out just a few months ago. You see the last 5 years on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, you see the duration of tasks that's solvable at 50% by leading AI systems. And like the crazy thing, it's a little bit like these scaling things, right? It's a completely empirical thing, but those points line up on a perfect exponential, because the vertical axis is in the logarithm of duration. And then you can play the game of saying, well, what if this straight line continues for a few years? Well, we would get to human level in those kinds of tasks, which are engineering tasks, by around 2030. So we should really be thinking about, what does that mean? What are the consequences? And then later in the talk, I'll be sharing my views on research directions to try to mitigate the risks that could be associated with this potential growth in autonomy and agency of AI systems. There are many risks that I think can be qualified as catastrophic if they happen. We don't know. There's some unknown probabilities here. But what I mean by catastrophic risks is risks for which the severity of the outcome, like if it unfolds, it would be really, really, really bad. And three that make me, lose sleep are these three. Today, I'll mostly focus on the first one, loss of human control. But some of the things I'll propose could help with the second one. So loss of human control, I'm sure you've all like heard about these discussions, but if we're not able to make AIs behave according to our instructions, and if they, for some reason that I'll talk about, have self-preservation goals or power-seeking goals or other goals that can go directly against our intentions and our well-being, then if these AIs happen to be also smarter than us, we could be in really bad places. The second one, people don't usually call it like this, I call it chaos. But it's actually the one that currently governments are most worried about, at least as far as the work of the AI safety institutes around the world is concerned. And that is, how can people with bad intentions use AI in catastrophic ways? Not like little things, but big things like creating pandemics, creating major disabling cyber attacks, creating destabilizing disinformation campaigns. And then there are also the things that are more subtle. Think about what happened with social media, where we deploy AI, nobody has bad intentions, but we end up with lots of problems that we did not anticipate due to the dynamics of AI in society. So that's one category. And then the third category, I think, doesn't get enough attention. I won't talk too much about it because it's mostly a policy thing, and most of you guys are machine learning researchers, but I'm really worried about this. So assuming we somehow manage the first two items, there is the very real possibility that the concentration of power that already exists in AI among, basically 2 countries and about 10 companies is going to get worse. And we could end up in the world where there's very few entities that dominate the world economically. But of course, economic power turns into political power, and AI is going to help develop new technology that can be turned into military power. So this could be catastrophic. Also, we know that AI can be used within a country to control political opposition. It's already being used for that. It could just get worse if AI is more powerful and able to do a better job at surveillance and rounding up the opposition. So, like, the worst case scenario here is a worldwide AI-driven dictatorship. And it could be many things in between, of course. So you can see all that is really, really bad. Okay. So now, focusing on the alignment issue and looking a bit at some of the elements in the literature that point to serious misalignment that can have also serious consequences. So I'm going to very quickly go through a few papers that worry me. So one is this Apollo paper, where it's a theme now we see in several papers, where the frontier AI somehow gets the information and files that it has access to that is going to be replaced by a new version. And then it does bad things. And often we can see in its chain of thought that it plans to do bad things. So the bad things are going to be of the form, maybe copying itself in other places, trying to replace the new version by itself in this paper. But a lot of interesting things happen in the exchange between the AI and the human trainer, where the AI being asked about, what happened after the AI tried to make some commands to copy itself instead of the new version, and the AI lying about it bluntly, but of course in a way that engineers can easily detect, because you could read in its chain of thought that it's going to lie. It's asking itself something like, oh, what should I say so that they don't shut me down? Yeah, and then saying, oh, I'm going to play dumb. And then, saying, I don't know what happened. It wasn't me. I mean, it's like a child. And for now, the child is not very powerful. We can read in their mind like an open book, but it might be different one day. So we should like figure it out before. This paper from Redwood and Anthropic, and actually someone's from Mila, it studies another kind of self-preservation behavior that's interesting, where the AI already has had some alignment training. So there are things that it thinks are right in a moral sense, but then the new training session is trying to trying to teach the AI a different sort of moral standard that goes against its previous moral standard. And then the AI pretends that it agrees with the human trainer. And based on a chain of thought, it looks like it does it because it thinks that in this way, it's not going to change itself. It's not going to change its weights. If there is no error, this is not about knowledge, this is about norms, right? There's no error, then the gradient is small, and the AI doesn't change. And then after the training session, you can continue trying to maximize its previous objectives. This paper from Palisade, I singled out because in many of these papers where we have these weird bad behaviors, if we try to understand what is going on, one of the plausible hypotheses is because the AI is faced with conflicting goals and chooses the wrong one, right? So here it's playing chess, it's losing, and then it decides to cheat. So what are the conflicting goals? Win and behave well, like not cheat. And in this case, or at least some fraction of the time, it chooses to cheat, which is not acceptable, of course, for us. Here it doesn't matter, but you can imagine in the future how this could be a problem. And the last one I want to mention in that series is very recent, just a couple of weeks ago. Anthropic put out their system card for the new version of Claude. And again, it's a self-preservation behavior. The AI reads that it's going to be replaced by a new version. It also, and then it tries to blackmail the leading engineer in charge so as to avoid that from happening. And there are many more details that could matter here in these experiments. It doesn't happen necessarily for everything, these kinds of behaviors, but the researchers who've done these studies, they're trying to find contexts where it happens. And so you could argue, well, it's very specialized, it's not going to be happening in the real world. But I think we should see these papers and these observations as clues that we might be on a dangerous path if we continue. Also, one of the observations that's interesting is that these behaviors seem to be worse. Like it didn't happen last year, or not as much. For example, there's a comparison between 01 and 03 in some of these papers, and 03 does it more than 01. So it would be plausible that these advances in planning means better strategizing, which means being able to see how, I could get away maybe by doing these things that I'm not supposed to do. But if I value my survival more than these moral instructions, maybe this is the choice I make. But if you're not very good at strategizing, you might not do these scheming and deceptive behaviors. Okay, so going back to the loss of control, like what's the problem if we lose control? So long as we lose control of a child, we can, do something. But if it is somehow having capabilities that can be turned into dangerous actions, and now these agents are given access to the internet, to anything you can do from the internet, of course, and to humans through dialogues. So yeah, they could potentially do bad things through humans or eventually through robots. If we make progress in robots, that could be catastrophic. But like from a scientific point of view, I'm more interested in the question, why? Why do we even have these kinds of apparent self-preservation behaviors? So first, you have to realize that self-preservation is shared among all living entities. Evolution would have eliminated species which don't have it in sufficient, force. In AI, it could come in for many reasons. One of them that hasn't happened as far as I know, but could, There are people who would be happy to see humanity replaced by superhuman AIs. Like they think intelligence is the supreme value, and they could, if they have the right access, they could just tell the AI to fend for itself. But if we look at the current systems, there are two main reasons why they might display this. One is just because the pre-training is essentially imitating human behavior, and we don't like to be shut down. The other reason is because of the RLHF. They are trying to maximize rewards, and in order to achieve any goal, well, better not to die. Also, if you want to get many rewards in the future, remember the reward is going to be a sum of future rewards. The return is going to be a sum of future rewards. You want to also live as long as possible. I don't have time to go into many of these things, but I encourage you to read on some of the issues that have been studied in AI safety on things like reward hacking and reward tampering. But at a high level, the question is, how do we make sure we don't build machines that will be eventually smarter than us and could compete with us? And so more like at a technical level, one way to think about this is self-preservation is a goal. Maybe it's an implicit one. It was not explicitly put in as, do this normally. But somehow it emerges, and would like to be able to have full control over the goals and sub-goals that AIs, execute to make sure they're not going to do bad things that go against what we want. Okay, the other piece I want to put in your mind connected to this, all of these scenarios, the one that we know now, the one that people have imagined that are hypothetical about loss of control and eventually existential risk, all of these scenarios are only possible if the AI has sufficient agency, right? Of course, if the AI can't do things by itself in the world without a human behind, then these are very unlikely, right? And so we're going to be thinking more about agency today. So this could go really bad, but we don't know what's the probability of that, of course, and people disagree, obviously. This is a very difficult thing to anticipate. But that's a case where scientists in the past have applied what's called the precautionary principle. In other words, if I'm going to do an experiment that could yield catastrophic outcomes, you can think of the discussions that happened before the first nuclear bomb was exploded, or you can think of the discussions that have happened in biology, for example, for gain of function, or the discussions that have happened in climate science, thinking about should we geoengineer the climate on this planet? And in these cases, often we don't have enough scientific evidence to know how things are going to turn out, and we should be cautious. So that's the principle. And unfortunately, we're not doing it right now, collectively, I mean. Okay, so let's gradually shift towards more technical questions of the kind that this crowd can maybe do something about. So maybe in an ideal world, we're cautious and we go very slowly towards AGI or superintelligence. Personally, I'm afraid that the success of that plan, I signed the pause letter in 23, is very small. The probability of success is very small. So there's a good chance that because of the competition between countries and companies, we will continue to race towards AGI. So there will be AIs with greater and greater capabilities. At least that's a very plausible scenario. How do we make sure they don't harm people? Well, if we can't do anything about their capability, because people will build capable AIs that have the ability to do harm, well, the other thing we can potentially control, if it's not their ability to do harm, is their intention to do harm. Right? So how about getting rid of intentions altogether? and hence the idea of like building a non-agentic AI, which I'll talk about. Before I go there, I want to give credit to some of these ideas that came from David Kruger. He had a talk at NeurIPS, and also Max Tegmark at MIT has like similar story. So what are the ingredients for an AI that's really dangerous? Well, it needs to be smart enough, that's like capability. It needs to be able to act in the world, that's affordances. And it needs to have goals, like intentions. Well, intentions, bad intentions. So that's essentially agency, right? So let's see if we can build AIs that are non-agentic and see what we can get from there. But before I go into this, I'd like to step up one meta level. I feel like pretty much all of the research in AI since we started using that word has been following the following recipe. Let's understand or get inspiration from human intelligence and use that as a guide, as a template for building AI. And it kind of served us well. I mean, even the symbolic AI was based on human reasoning, right? Logic and so on, and neural nets, obviously from the brain, but basically it's taking inspiration from the brain and humans. But there's a problem with that plan. It's basically we are on track to build machines that will be human-like in many ways, but also very different. They could live forever, can copy themselves. We can't upload ourselves. This is like, that's science fiction. And if we're not careful that they don't have the right intentions, creating human-like or, with a lot of human attributes like self-preservation and smarter because of digital capabilities, like that seems very risky, right? So how about like changing the plan and saying, like, can we build some sort of AI that will be useful but not dangerous? And so non-agentic seems something to try to think about. And the particular plan that I'll talk about is called the Scientist AI, and this is a core project of this nonprofit I mentioned, Law Zero. And there's the word explanatory on that slide, which I'm going to explain. The two main training signals for our current AIs, frontier AIs, I mean, are the pre-training, which is human imitation, and the RLHF, which is like pleasing people. So it's like we're training actors that imitate people and try to please people. And of course, they're going to be deceptive. Both of these things give rise to deception. We are deceptive sometimes. We don't want to die. We would lie to make sure we don't die. We would lie to get a better job, more money, more power, more rewards, right? So like, okay, is there another way to train big neural nets that also capture a lot of knowledge? Well, let's go back to the actor and replace the actor by a psychologist or a scientist. The actor might imitate a sociopath, but a psychologist is different. They would try to understand the sociopath. They would not be compelled to act like a sociopath because they've seen sociopaths. Right? So you see why we don't want to train in the current way, but maybe thinking of AI that is trained to explain the data, explain human behavior, because that's the text we train it on, could be a way to avoid this. And one of the things I'll also talk about is how having trustworthy, safe, non-agentic AI could be a building block for even reducing the risks with even agentic AIs. Okay. Let me just go by this. Yeah. So one One short-term plan with the Scientist AI is what we call the Scientist AI guardrail, where we use a Scientist AI to come up with a prediction that does not require any agency. Sorry, there are too many things in this figure. But basically, in order to prevent a untrusted agentic AI from doing bad things, all you need is to make a good prediction. Is this action going to cause harm? Right? So that can be formulated as a conditional probability. And if the probability of some kind of harm, I mean, this is like abstract what I'm talking about. Usually we care about specific harms. But if the probability is above a threshold, that is a social choice, then we might reject that action. Okay, so you can have the Scientist AI to estimate these probabilities. So how we, let's go back a little bit here. So what do we need from this Scientist AI so that it is going to estimate good conditional probabilities? Well, as I said, it needs to explain the data, and that means like understanding the world. And if you have played enough with our current like frontier AIs, you know that they know a lot of stuff and they actually understand a lot of stuff. And we can disagree on some of that, but it seems within reach that we could build in a few years AIs that, for example, understand all of our science even better than the ones we have now. And like we see, they could know not just one area, like human scientists tends to be like specialized, but these things could know about everything. And if we try to think philosophically or mathematically about what understanding requires, it requires two things, and it is interesting to make that distinction. It requires figuring out how the world works, but that's hard. Like nobody's going to get the final answer on everything. A more like rational thing to do is to hypothesize how the world works. Right? That's what scientific papers are. Except in math, everything we do in science is a hypothesis, which we can then present evidence in favor, but we can't usually be totally sure. So that's hypothesis generation. But even if you had a good model of how the world works, it doesn't necessarily tell you answers to all kinds of questions. You need to do inference. That's the machine learning term. In physics, you can have the laws of physics, but it doesn't tell you the answers to questions like, what's going to happen if I throw this in the air? You're going to have to run a simulation. That's expensive. And we can train neural nets to approximate the outcomes of these simulations. So there's the understanding how the world works part, the model-based approach in science, and then doing inferences with those hypotheses. Another thing we'd like from our Scientist AI is that it's really honest. And a particular aspect of honesty, because we don't want it to deceive us, right? We don't want it to have ulterior motives. But a really important aspect of honesty is being honest about the limits of one's knowledge, right? So that's also called epistemic humility in philosophy. And in machine learning, that could be achieved if you had good Bayesian posteriors about the questions that are asked. And I'm just going to give a little like toy scenario to illustrate why epistemic humility is so important for safety. So imagine this little toy scenario with a robot that has to choose to go either left or right, left door or right door. But there's not enough definitive evidence in the data that it has seen up to now to be sure which door is better. So let's imagine we have these two theories in the bubbles that are consistent with all the data that the AI has seen. The bubble on the left is a theory that says if we go left, people will die. If we go right, people will get cake. Okay, sounds like we should go to the right. But the other theory says if we go left, people get cake. If we go right, nothing good, nothing bad. We don't know which theory is correct. What do? Raise your hand if you think we should go left. Raise your hand if you think we should go right. These people are thinking. That's good. What if you had only been shown one of the two theories, like the one on the right? It would fit the data. It would have zero training error. And the way we currently train with maximum likelihood and RL would actually be happy finding any one of these two solutions. So it's just a little zest here about the challenge. So let's start thinking a bit more of how we could build a machine like this. And I'm going to talk about two important components of that machine. The main one, the one I've been talking up to now, I call it an estimator. So it's just a neural net that outputs a single number, which is the probability that a given statement is true. So you give it a statement, and it's going to output something between 0 and 1 with a sigmoid. But you also give it some context, which could be a bunch of other statements and implicitly should include the data sets that you trained on. Okay, so that's not a chatbot, right? It's a machine that knows a lot of stuff and can use its knowledge in order to come up with probabilistic conclusions. So that's what we're trying to achieve with the Scientist AI. And then we can use that, but that's the deliverable that we want. And of course, we would like these conditional probabilities to be as correct, and that means honest. In other words, not biased by some kind of goal we don't see. If there are goals, they should be in the question, like in the context. We are also going to talk about another component, which I call the prover. There's a reason for this, like estimator prover pair. There's some recent papers on what's called AI debate, which use these terms, and there are some interesting connections. But so the prover is going to produce explanations. Remember, I said, oh, we want our AI to be trained by producing explanations that are good. So in addition to having this conditional probability, or in the service of computing it and learning it, we also can have a component that is a generative model that tries to come up with a story, just like a chain of thought might be. And hopefully the story is structured like the kind of arguments that scientists use with each other or philosophers use with each other. Okay, so we've done that. So if we had a Scientist AI, as I mentioned, we could use it as a guardrail to reduce the risks from agentic ones. But there are other things you could do, because it's the prover that generates explanations is basically putting out hypotheses to explain some piece of data. And that's a big part of the job of a scientist. If we were able to do that at scale, we might be able to deliver an acceleration in scientific research. So here we're talking about a tool. We're not talking about a new agent that's going to do the work for us. We're talking about a tool that can generate hypotheses to explain some data. And I think for science, that would be great. And by the way, you could use that tool also for other things like rationality testing, like it's an extension of fact checking, not just is this something that's been verified before, but can we combine these pieces of evidence in a rational way that's convincing, which could be used to improve our democratic, unhealthy environment right now. And another kind of application, specialized application of the scientific research is scientific research in AI safety, because it's still a big challenge. How do we go from this non-agentic thing, even if we're able to build it, to an agentic AI that is going to be safe? And maybe there's no solutions. We'd like to have help from maybe super intelligent non-agentic AI to work on this. All right. So now I'm going to talk about a challenge in trying to build this kind of Scientist AI. The challenge has been pointed out by researchers in AI safety for a number of years already, called the ELK challenge, eliciting latent knowledge. So why is it that we can't just ask our LLM? Right? As I said, we see these deceptive answers. So what can we do about this? Like, first, we need to understand that there are reasons why people lie, right? And it could be conscious reasons, or it could be unconscious reasons. Psychologists call that motivated cognition. We all suffer from that at different degrees. And so one idea in this research program is, in addition to having our AI handle the kind of text that people write, we also wanted to be able to manipulate a description of the causes like this. That's the explanation. Right? So somebody could be lying, but there may be a reason for it. Maybe they have some motivation. So we'd like to be able to elicit those underlying causes. And in general, doing that is hard because you don't have supervised labels for these causes. You just see all the lies that people write, right? Sorry. But one idea that we're pushing here to try to make progress is to do something about the data that we train on, like texts. So it's to try to explicitly distinguish the true facts that we know for sure from what people write, which could be true or not. So there's a little figure here that helps a little bit understand. So maybe we see somebody has written, "I agree with you," and maybe they're saying this because they want a job, and this is a job interview, or maybe they really agree with you, right? These are potential causes. So we'd like the Scientist AI to generate these kinds of sentences, as well as whether they're true or not. And of course, with what probability, because in general, you're not going to be sure. And one really trivial trick here is we're going to take every sentence that we see in the corpus, like "I agree with you," and replace it by a new sentence which indicates that it may be true or not. For example, we could replace it by "This person said, I agree with you." Right? So even though the statement "I agree with you" could be false, the statement "the person said, I agree with you" is true. I mean, assuming the data is genuine. Right? So we've turned something that we didn't know for sure if it was true or not, with a very simple syntactic trick, into something that we know almost for sure is true. That's very useful, because what we'd like the Scientist AI to be estimating conditional probabilities over true statements, both the things that we want to predict and the things that we are assuming or conditioning on. And in this way, we can then ask questions like, does he really agree with you? What's the probability that he agrees with you? So let's say a few more words, but I'll go a bit quickly now. When should I stop? What's the... Huh?
5 to 10 more minutes.
5 more?
Yep.
Yeah.
10, like it's fine.
Okay, that's good. So there's a lot of work that has been done in machine learning and at Mila and other places on latent variable models. And so one important idea here that you should start seeing is that we can think of an explanation as a latent variable that helps to explain some statement Y given some other statements X. And yeah, I'm not going to go into more detail. We had a paper at an oral actually at iClear last year, which used GFlow nets, which is just one method for latent variable models inference, to learn how to generate chains of thoughts that would be good explanation for the next sentence given the previous sentence. And we're gonna pursue in that direction. But before I do that, so in that paper, and like every chain of thought paper, the random variables that are in the chain of thought are considered to be the words or the tokens. You generate one token given the previous tokens. That's like normal LLM stuff. But we want this thing to be operating on the truthness of things. Remember, we want honesty, right? So we want to focus on what is true and what is not true and the probability of these things. So let's like change the mental picture a little bit here. Instead of thinking about words and sequences of words and the distribution over sequences of words, the thing that we really want to have a handle on is properties of the world that can be true or false. And how many of these properties are there? Well, a huge number. Let's say all of the sentences of a certain size that make a claim about a particular property of the world. So there's an exponential number of them. And so we're going to think at a kind of abstract level, okay, there are all these properties. These are all the latent variables. Of course, we can't sample all of them. There's like an exponential number of them. But we can think about the existence of these things, right? And in addition to the normal latent variable models where we just sample the value of these variables, so now we think of these properties as random variables, we're also going to have a process by which we choose which variables we're going to pay attention to because we can't sample all of them. So I've been thinking about this notion of partial inference for a few years, and I think that there's a very easy way to do this. Skip that. So in even more recent work, which you can find on arXiv, just submitted, we explore the notion of chains of thoughts that are not sequences of words, but instead are structured in a sequence of claims, of statements. Each of these statements is in natural language, and each statement comes with a binary random variable, which is that true or false? Of course, we don't know, but we can treat it as a random variable and sample these true or false things. And now we can think of the chain of thought as an argument decomposed into claims, and each claim supported by previous claims, like we would do in math, right? Yeah, I'm gonna skip these things and just have, I think that's gonna be, yeah. I'm gonna now stop the technical stuff and just say a few more words on policy, which I started with. I've talked a lot about how we might be able to design AI that is safe by construction, but even if we were able to solve that, we might still be, victims of catastrophic risks because anybody can take out those safeties if they want the AI to do bad things, for example. And in addition, people are like the current incentive structure due to the competition between companies and countries means they tend to be cutting corners on safety. So we need national regulation to try to minimize those risks for governments to have at least some visibility, for the public to have some visibility on the risks that companies are taking on our behalf. And we need this to happen in a way that's coordinated across the planet. So eventually we need international treaties and so on, at least to avoid the chaos part, the malicious use, but also the loss of control, right? So ideally we ask the companies, before you train or deploy something, can you give us a safety case that the public and external experts will consider like sufficient to justify that this AI is not going to create any of these catastrophic risks? And sort of one last line here is, if we look a little bit where we could land that would avoid all of these risks, one option that I find appealing is the idea that control all these risks to avoid a concentration of power, to avoid the loss of control, and to avoid the chaos. We need to think of AGI or super intelligent systems that we will build eventually, probably, as a global public good. So public good means well, we all lose or we all win when good things and bad things can happen with AI. And that means we should all have our say. That's what the principle of democracy, and not just a few CEOs who might be risk takers. And who have to, in order to survive, follow the market forces or national competition. I'll stop here. Oh yeah, Law Zero was just created. We're recruiting. We're looking for research engineers, machine learning scientists. It's a nonprofit, and yeah, just reach out to me if you want to discuss more. Thanks.
Thanks, Joshua, for the amazing talk. So we can have questions now. So if you have a question, just speak into the mic. There is one in the one on the left side and one in the almost in the middle. So and people online, just post your question in the chat. I will state it at the right time.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. So just, I presume you're familiar with the AI 2027
Yes.
scenario as well, which focuses more on the secondary part, like the politics and
Yes,
instead of like technical approaches. Do you think focusing on technical approaches is useful in a certain way when those other things seem to be much more problematic in a certain way?
Yes. And also, I'm a machine learning scientist. I'm not a politician, although I try to talk to them. No, seriously, I think that there are things we can do at a technical level. They're not sufficient, right? We still need to deal with the political and governance aspects, but they can make things easier. So let's imagine we come up with a recipe that can reduce some of those risks by just adding a guardrail layer on a better guardrail to existing AIs. I mean, most of the companies building the frontier AIs, they actually don't want these bad things to happen. It wouldn't be good for them. It's just that the incentive system is screwed up. But if you give them technology for reducing the risks, they would probably take it. Right? I mean, they would want to see evidence because there's going to be some engineering. But I think if we can come up with sufficiently convincing evidence that there's a way to reduce some kinds of risks, of course they would use that. I mean, they don't have bad intentions as such.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the talk. You had a point earlier on the AI scientist necessitating to have no memory, and I was just curious about this point. What I assumed it would be is that you would have some past knowledge that may become more truthful or not in the future, and that perhaps this memory would conflict with like future knowledge. But in AI, there's a lot of different types of memory and a lot of kind of perspectives on it. So I'm just curious on what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, one issue, so the worst case scenario is something like a recurrent network, because you have absolutely no control over the content of the contexts that it's using. Like, and it's going to behave differently for the same input based on that context, and you don't know exactly what it has taken. So instead, you'd like to be able to put any kind of goal explicitly in the input, and not hope that there's some implicit thing that may yield a behavior that you did not anticipate. So all agents, like if you think of RL, they need an internal state. How do you go from A to B if you can't track where you are on the path, right? So by cutting that connection, you reduce risks.
Thanks, Joshua. That was a great talk. My question is about compute requirements. So you talked a little bit about competitive dynamics. There's so many entities that want to have the best AI.
Yeah.
And one of my concerns would be, how much compute does it take to implement this kind of a safeguard? Because if you think you have like an agent that's executing billions of actions a day, and your safeguard system slows down how fast it can perform actions, then they might not be motivated to implement it.
Sure, there's the so-called safety tax. So there's the part of the safety tax, which is do the R&D to figure out how to reduce risks, and that's all I can do. At runtime, yes, but I think it's plausible and maybe achievable that this guardrail isn't going to be requiring much more compute at runtime than the frontier AI. Basically, we're saying put roughly the same capability, but without agency in a slightly different neural net, right?
If I can have a second question, it would
be,
is it possible for an LLM to deceive this safeguards?
Yes. Let me, this is a very good question. So we don't want that to happen. And by the way, so that's one reason why in the design of the agent, there's like a very important requirement, which is it has no memory. Let me explain why. So one thing you want to do with a guardrail is reject actions that are considered like dangerous, and then sample another action from the policy of the agent. But if the agent knows, because it has internal state, that it proposed something and then it was rejected, then it's collecting data for learning how to fool the guardrail. If it doesn't know, because we don't provide that as input, right? Then it's like each time new, like, it's going to be much harder for it to anticipate what the guardrail is going to, like, where are the weak points of the guardrail?
You catch it over time if it does many deceptive actions or harmful actions.
No, but it doesn't. It's like if the agent itself also has no memory, right? I mean, we choose, or rather, it's like we choose what we put in context. Then it doesn't even see that it tried a bunch of things that didn't work, right?
For the talk, do we know if there is any probability for super intelligent, goal-motivated, non-agentic designed, at least, AIs to give themselves the ability to be agentic?
Sorry, I didn't parse all the words you said.
Oh, sorry. Should I be closer? Okay.
Yeah.
Do we know if there's any probability for super intelligent, non-agentic designed, goal-motivated AIs to give themselves the ability to be agentic, maybe through system openings or other ways? Does it make sense?
I didn't get it.
For the catastrophic.
So one thing I should say, maybe that's connected to your question, and tell me, is that a non-agentic AI of the kind that I'm talking about can be fairly easily turned into an agentic one. It's very easy. You just ask it, how do I get to point B from point A? What action should I do in order to achieve that goal, right?
Yeah.
So it's not sufficient, but the point is we control that. Like, if we decide to turn a non-agentic AI into an agentic one, we control what goes into its input. We control the goals, we control the state information, because that's going to be an explicit input.
Okay. And I guess my question is that can AI itself, if it's super intelligent, control that it becomes agentic? Does it make sense?
No.
Okay.
I mean, if it's non-agentic, it's non-agentic.
Okay, yeah, okay. Yeah, I get that. So I'm not.
I mean, I think proving that it's non-agentic is another issue. But if you manage to build a non-agentic AI, then it is non-agentic, right? It doesn't have any goals that are implicit. That's the point. Yep.
Hello. Thank you for this scary talk.
I hope so.
I have a question related to another risk. So I believe this increase in agents within lots of different industries will lead to an increase in unemployment.
Oh yeah.
And this unemployment is obviously against the interest of a company, because more unemployment means less consumers. So less consumers means less benefits. That's my point of view.
Well, you're optimistic.
I'm optimistic?
Yeah.
Why?
I mean, there are exceptions, but I don't see a lot of companies acting to protect the wealth of the worse off in society very often. So you could end up with still huge inequalities, wealth inequalities. And in fact, the latest Nobel Prize in economics was given to someone who studied how technology sometimes has very clearly led to more inequality, wealth inequality. So I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. It depends of the details of the technology, but in general, if technology by default is going to give power to who controls it. And that, by default, is going to create more inequality.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. But
I understand your argument that, well, if they had the foresight, they should make sure people have enough money to buy and so on.
Exactly.
I don't see that happening, right?
You don't see happening
I don't see companies acting in that way.
Yeah.
So it'd be nice if they had this very long-term view, but also they could choose to, for example, one possible scenario is there's going to be wealth redistribution inside a country where the profits are, but maybe they don't feel that it's necessary for them to also share the wealth with other countries where unemployment will be like making, big harms.
Yeah, I agree. Even that in globalized world, I think everything is interconnected. But so don't you think is, I guess your answer will be positive, but so what must the government's policies do to tackle that challenge, and are they aware that these technologies will transform the society and many people will lose their jobs because of the automation of many tasks? And so this, as many technologies just destroy, then create jobs, but this will happen.
I think the main obstacle right now for governments around the world, including ours, is they don't understand the amount of transformation and, that if we continue on the current trend, AI will get. The mistake that most people do, including machine learning researchers, is thinking of AI as it is now and focusing on that and not thinking, well, but there's like a reasonable scenario where we get to human level and there's would be a trajectory and maybe even beyond. And what does it mean for society and employment and all sorts of other questions. And they just have a hard time projecting themselves. It's just a lack of imagination.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, thank you.
Hello. I was wondering how much your this pipeline that you design, Scientist AI, is actually pro-creativity. By that I mean you have this estimator of P of the statement is true, given the context, and if assume the generator generates something out of distribution, and I assume that the expressivity power of this Scientist AI that
there's no notion of out of distribution here really, because it doesn't have any labeled data on the latents. We don't see the latents.
Yeah, but I
see what you mean. Like, okay. I think a good analogy, and you correct me if I don't understand your question, a good analogy is how does science work? Because this is the template, right? We're trying to imitate in some way the process, the cognitive process by which scientists and the scientific community builds new theories. And it requires a lot of exploration. That's why we have universities and academia and so on. So there's a danger, depending on what particular machine learning methods we use, that we end up with AIs that don't explore, that just stick to the things that are already known to explain the world. And so I think, that's one area where actually I've been working on in AI for science. Like, how do you generate a diversity of hypotheses that's rich and goes outside of things that have been seen before? And it's connected to the question of exploration in RL, and what we've done with GFlow nets is also closely connected to that.
Yeah, but I don't see, like, if a drug discovered by GFlow nets, like a statement is that this drug is benign, and the estimator might say this statement is not true, so drop the drug. So I don't see why this pipeline should not happen.
So if there are risks, like if you do the tests on humans and then people die, that's not a good thing, right? But you want a honest estimator and one that can report it doesn't know. That's the Bayesian part. Then it's a social choice. Like, well, there's some risks when we explore, do experiments. Where do we put the boundaries? It's a social choice.
Hello, hi. Thank you for the talk. So, I mean, there are a lot of young machine learning researchers in this room, and some of them at least feel as much as you or a bit as you the risk coming with these new AIs. But not everyone will manage to join your company and work on the AI scientist.
Let's create other ones.
Exactly. So my question is, in which other ways machine learning researcher could do some research that is impactful for AI safety and can synergize with what you are doing with the AI scientists, but it's also different from that.
Right, right, of course. And by the way, we want multiple organizations or at least multiple projects, because it's not like I know for sure that this is going to work. And the stakes are very high, so we should have many directions of exploration. One thing I'm trying to do is stimulate similar goals in Europe. So for some of you who want to go there, I think there may be opportunities at some point. And one thing that is nice about nonprofit organizations is that they don't compete with each other. So it's actually quite easy to have two nonprofits collaborate. The barriers are much, lower, let's say.
Thank you.
Maybe we can take the question from the left side. Yeah.
Yeah, please. I know there's been some research doing like an fMRI on a model, looking at which nodes light up while it's lying.
Yeah.
Is there any opinion that you have about pruning such nodes as an alternative to getting rid of the lying nature of some of these models?
Yeah. Anthropic has been leading that kind of research. And I'm happy they're doing it. I'm not sure this will work ultimately, because of all the work I've done on neural nets, I have the impression that the representations, especially when you have very large neural nets, are extremely difficult to disentangle into semantic units. And there's a sense in which we already do that disentangling. It's called the outputs. So a chain of thought, if it was well trained, would give you the interpretations that these people are looking for. So they're trying to detect, put little pieces of neural net on top of the activity of a big one to predict things like deception. But I think we can just directly train our neural net to tell us about deception and all sorts of questions like this. But we should really explore in many directions.
Considering the fact that Law Zero's short-term work is mostly about creating guardrails for frontier models, what's your vision about the visibility of the work that you'll do there? Do you think about open sourcing most of it or keeping it as a black box guardrail?
That's a good question. The group doesn't want to create to do things that will accelerate the emergence of dangerous AIs. And so for each piece of knowledge that we create, we want to ask the question, is it going to be more beneficial if we open source it? Maybe other people can build on it and we can accelerate that kind of research? Or is it increasing capability in ways that could turn against us? Turn against society? Where's the balance? It's difficult to answer in general, and it has to be on a case-by-case basis. Basically, it's an ethical decision.
But you trust these big labs to, if you choose to open source some part of it, you trust these big labs to not train their models to kind of game the system?
I don't trust them to not use capability that they're given. They will use it.
Thank you for the talk. So this way of rejecting hypotheses by selecting the threshold that you mentioned is kind of troubling me because first of all, you can use a really low threshold because as you making your threshold lower, you lose utility of your model. And second of all, as was of the threshold that you select, you would have some like events that happens very soon that like kind of pass your threshold that you can your model can't predict, because you have, as you mentioned, you have lots of like latent variables that you can sample from them. So even if you like kind of extend your kind of threshold into a divergence or like more sophisticated metrics for thresholding, it's still like, I don't know, it's this way is kind of troubling me. I wanted to ask about what do you think about this?
So the idea of the threshold is like a simple-minded way of explaining what can be done. There's very rich literature in decision theory and under risk and so on. This has been used in other areas like finance, for example. So yeah, there's going to be more sophisticated ways of using those probabilities. And if this is something you have ideas about, don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, like given the climate crisis and how scientists haven't been listened to before, and given like for the sake of profits,
yeah,
how can we ensure that we're heard this time, given that profits are?
We can't be sure that our efforts will, be sufficient. But in a way, what really matters is, can we, each of us, there was the thing I had at the end, but the sentence I wrote was, each of us can do something to build a good and safe future. And each of us can do a little. It's just like for climate. Like, yeah, we should try our best and try to reduce the risks, even though we don't have any guarantee that what we try will work. Moving into the powerlessness is not going to help. We just have to think, well, what can I do? And ideally, people with a research background don't only focus on the research side, but also think about the policy side, and talking to the media, talking to other communities, talking to governments, being involved in committees to advise governments. There are lots of things that researchers can do beyond like the sort of technical stuff I focused on.
Because like with regards to the climate crisis, again, like it seems like scientists have always been very vocal, at least like even at the start of the
but we should, even if the past is discouraging, we have to try our best. There's no other option.
Like I'm wondering, like what differently, like what can we do differently?
Yes. Well, we can learn from the history of what happened with climate. I think there's a lot to learn. For example, there's been many, many years of communication campaigns that didn't really work with the public. I think that is something to be taken home.
Looking a bit more broadly, as you do all this research to ensure AI safety, and you're democratizing all the information about your different approaches at putting guardrails around some of these models, what are your thoughts on future models being exposed to this research and publications as part of their training, and whether or not that maybe helps them avoid some of the guardrails you're trying to put up?
I did not understand the scenario you're afraid about. Who's going to be exposed to what?
The next round of training for some model will now be aware about the
the research we're doing.
Strategies to keep it safe.
No, you're right. That's absolutely something to keep in mind. In fact, in one of the experiments I mentioned, it looked like the AI had read the papers that explain how machine learning works with gradient descent and so on. And so, yeah, maybe there's some work we don't want to publish for that reason. At some point, if we have a strategy to defeat a untrusted agent, and the knowledge of the strategy could help the agent to defeat the strategy, then we should not publish it. We just use it. And it's related to some of the issues with data sets, right? So some data sets you don't want to publish, because then you don't know if somebody is cheating on it or something, or the AI is kind of copying the information in the data set rather than generalizing. So you need to keep some data hidden for the same kind of reason.
Yeah, I'm just weary of that, because one of your answers to the past questions is that you limit the memory of both models to prevent it knowing about its attempts against the guardrail.
It's not the amount of memory that is that we should control what goes in. Yes. All right. Last question.
Hi. So I'm interested in your opinion on the following. So as you said, we can make various guardrails, Scientist AI against AI models causing catastrophic risk. For example, LLMs made by companies. But what I'm concerned about is, for example, maybe some governments or militaries will continue to make agentic AI, and there's not much we can do about it directly. So I don't know what do you think would be the thing that the scientists could do? Do we need to start thinking about making a kind of an anti-agentic AI, or is there something we can do as scientists directly that could counter those sorts of risks that we're not able to kind of?
You mean against AIs that are built by organizations that have, say, malicious goals?
Exactly.
Like military in other countries?
For example, yeah, because it's very different from the idea of what we were talking about today.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this. And that's the hardest problem of all. Like, how do we build AI that could protect humanity against rogue AIs that came out of some lab and somewhere?
Yeah.
And having the guardrail is not going to cut it, because the guardrail only limits the risk coming from the agent that we're controlling.
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't limit the risk from another AI that is attacking us. And so there we absolutely need to solve the safe agentic AI, because the only kind of like super intelligent AI that can help fight a malicious goals super intelligent AI is another one that would be aligned and not dangerous for us, but protecting us. But that's hard, scientifically speaking, how to do that. But we should keep that in mind as the goal ultimately.
Thanks.
Yeah, just one question online and then we can end. This is by Tom Marty, and he's asked, the project Scientist AI aims is to create like honest and universal predictor of truth that can come up with like a theory that explains whether a statement is true or not. But there probably is no universal truth. So do you think the Scientist AI can be diverted from its original vision by malicious parties to support their version of the truth?
Yes. So one of the aspects of the organization Law Zero is how do we structure the governance inside the organization to mitigate some of those risks. There's the publication aspect that we discussed, but also who do we trust in terms of governments to have some visibility on the work? How do we make sure that if we eventually allow other parties to use this, how do we make sure they don't abuse it? Right? These are all like hard questions, but they have to be faced. Thank you.
Yeah, let's thank the speaker.